Lesson 23. After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus came, or, and Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. So we see here that John now records some of the acts and the words of Jesus in the Galilee region, north of Judea. John mainly recorded things that Jesus did and said in Judea and Jerusalem, but sometimes included material that the other gospel writers also wrote of, mainly the Galilee region. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John don't all cover identical things. They deviate from what the others say and include or exclude various details. Jesus went out to a deserted place to be alone, it says in Luke 9:10. Yet the crowds followed him there. In spite of this imposition, Jesus still served the multitude with great compassion. Luke 9:11 tells us that Jesus also taught this multitude, something that John doesn't specifically mention in his gospel. John is the only one of the four gospel writers who told us this took place near the time of the Passover. Perhaps this great multitude was made up of Galilean pilgrims on their way to Jerusalem. Passover is associated with the Exodus and God's sustenance of Israel in the wilderness. It said there that he went up on the mountain. The high ground is the sharply rising terrain east of the lake, well known today as the Golan Heights. Verses 5 through 7 go on to say, when Jesus lifted up his eyes and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread that these may eat? But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that everyone might then have a little. So John does not say, as Mark does in his gospel, that the crowd had been listening to Jesus' teaching all day. But this explains his concern about feeding them. They were tired and hungry. Jesus knew that uh, the miracle he was about to perform was going to feed them, but he wanted to use this opportunity also to teach his disciples. For Jesus, this wasn't only about getting a job done, he had other purposes for this miracle. So, 89 go on. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many? Andrew once again introduced someone to Jesus. First, it was his brother Peter, back in John chapter 1. Now it was the lad with some barley loaves and 2 fish. Verses 10 and 11. Then Jesus said, make the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as many as they wanted. Jesus only had a few loaves of bread and a few fish, but he was determined to give his Father thanks for what he did have. 12 through 13. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, "Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing be lost." Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets of fragments from the 5 barley loaves and the fish, which were eaten. Though the disciples did not understand or anticipate the miracle, Jesus invited them to participate in it. They distributed the miraculously multiplied bread and fish. Without their work, no one would have been fed that day in this large crowd. It only talks about the men, but there were women and children there, which made the number fed much larger. Verse 14. I'll hold off. I just noticed the time. Stop here for this lesson.